Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome once again to the Bhagavad-gita virtual Satsang, our webinar series. My name is Hari-kirtana, and thank you very, very much for being here. I trust that you can hear me, but only so much. If you would do me the favor of raising your hand just to let me know that in fact you can hear me. Ah, there we go. Faith is the mandatory prerequisite for knowledge. Thank you. You can go ahead and put your hands back down. It's very nice to see you insofar as I can't actually see you. You don't have to worry about your camera or your microphone. You can see me and hear me obviously now, and I cannot see or hear you. We'll take care of our usual housekeeping. There's some controls for you up in the corner. You can adjust your video, you can adjust your audio settings there. Let me share the screen with you for just a moment, just to make sure that I've not forgotten anything. So this is episode 17 in our series. Please feel free to type into the Q&A at any point in time. If you have a question, I will be keeping my eye on the Q&A box for that very specific purpose of looking for the questions I hope you have and that I hope I have an answer for. We'll see how I do. Anyway, I hope you're doing well. I'm looking forward to continuing with this series with you this evening. Last week, we took a look at the art of sacrifice, or more, a deeper look at the art of sacrifice in chapter 3 of the Bhagavad-gita, the necessity of participating in a constructive way in the cycles of nature, how our failure to constructively participate ends up gumming up the works. We looked at the nature of independent action, how one actually becomes independent, and the necessity of action for the benefit of others. We will be elaborating on the themes from chapter 3, verses 16 through 20 as we move further into this chapter on karma yoga, where we will talk about exemplary action, and Krishna's own example of exemplary action. We'll also examine the question, if what you're doing is not perceived as helping, then what is it? So verses 21 through 26. What if my name isn't Faith? This is a... Well, I'm really not sure. It may be that knowledge is unattainable for you. Perhaps there's a workaround. Okay, here we go. But first, a blast from the past. This is Princess Diana. You may remember her. This photo was taken on April 19th, 1987. And she's doing something that in 1987 was an extraordinary thing. She's shaking the hands of a person who has AIDS. She arrived at London Middlesex Hospital to open the United Kingdom's first unit dedicated to specifically treating people with HIV and AIDS. And at that time, it was such a scary, mysterious condition that people had all kinds of fears that you could get AIDS simply by touching something that someone with AIDS had touched, to say nothing of actually touching a person who had AIDS without gloves. And by going to the hospital and shaking the hand of this AIDS patient without gloves and making sure the press was there to see it, Princess Diana demonstrated courageous leadership in order to free people who had AIDS from this stigma, and to prove that this idea that you could contract AIDS merely by touching someone with AIDS was just a product of mass hysteria and paranoia with no basis in truth. So she used the fact that she was famous, respected person, in order to give an example of courageous leadership. Which brings us to our verses. And the first, we'll start out this evening with the verse that we're going to chant. And then I will go through all of the translations and then come back and look at each of these translations in detail. Text 21 from the 3rd chapter. I chant, you chant back. Yad yada charati shreshtas tat tad eve taro janaha sayat pramanam kurute lokas tad anuvartate. Translation of this verse. The actions of a great leader will surely be emulated by others, and the standards set by such a leader serve as the example for all the world to follow. So I'll leave that up on the screen for you, just to take that in, and I will ask you to think. What kind of actions does a great leader take? Can you think of a great leader who has led by an example that has influenced your life? Okay. So we'll come back to this verse. Meanwhile, we'll continue with the balance of the verses that we're going to cover this evening. Text 22. O son of Pritha, Arjuna, there are no duties within the 3 worlds that I am obliged to perform, nor is there anything I aspire to obtain. Nevertheless, I engage myself in prescribed duties. Text 23. For should I ever cease to engage in carefully performing such prescribed duties, O Partha, people would surely follow my example in all respects. Text 24. All these worlds would fall to ruin if I did not act properly. I would be the cause of chaos in society and would thereby bring harm to all beings. Text 25. O descendant of Bharat, Arjuna, as the ignorant act with attachment to the results of their actions, the wise may act without such attachment for the sake of the world's welfare. Text 26. A learned person should not disturb the minds of those who, due to a poor fund of knowledge, act with attachment to the fruits of their actions. Instead, the wise inspire delight in prescribed duties by performing them in a spirit of devotion. Earlier, at the end of the 2nd chapter, Arjuna asked Krishna to describe a person who had attained the state of self-knowledge of elevated consciousness that he had previously described. And Arjuna, and Krishna, gave a description of a person who is detached from the results of one's action, who is free from passion, fear, and anger, who is equipoised in happiness and distress. And one might easily get the idea that such a person in a condition of such detachment might not feel obliged to do anything. Paradoxically, however, Krishna is urging Arjuna to act. So Arjuna is trying to figure out, well, how do I put these two things together? You want me to fight? Well, what are people's motivations for fighting? Well, anger, fear, passion. You know, those are all the things that go into fighting. How is Arjuna supposed to fight without those three things in play? So here's where Krishna is now speaking about how one who is risen above any need for action, any requirement for action, still has a duty to act if action is called for. And he gives himself as an example. Now, I saw a few of you raise your hands just a few moments ago, and I'm not sure why you're raising your hands. Maybe you have a question. You can type a question into the Q&A box if you have a question. If you don't see the Q&A box and it's not working for you, raise your hand. And then if anyone raises their hand, I will know that we have an issue. And I see no one raising their hand, even though there's a little bit of a delay. I'll assume that we're good to go. Okay, now if you do have a question about any of this, of course, pop it into the Q&A box and I will see it. Okay, let's go back to our verse. So once again, this example of a great leader acts in such a way that their actions will be copied by others. So earlier I asked you, all right, well, who's a great leader? Who's somebody that you admire, whose actions you think you would like to emulate and that you would hope that others would emulate as well? On the assumption that you've had a moment or two to think about that, let's turn it around. Let's assume that you are a great leader and that your actions will be emulated by others. No pressure. How will you act? Imagine yourself in this position. You are a great leader, respected by millions of people. And now it is your responsibility Would you do anything differently than from the way that you do it now? I've just got to notice that my internet connection is a little unstable. So if I short out on you, I'll be right back. So don't go away. Now let's go. All right, so we have a question. Hold on. I would probably be a person of few words and try to listen more than I speak. This could provide a wonderful example, given how loud and chattery our world has become. So this is a nice example. And I think this is a great leadership quality, the inclination and ability to listen and be able to genuinely hear and be selective and thoughtful about what one says and when one says it. I was speaking to a friend of mine some years ago about someone he admired. And one of the things that he admired about this person is that if a question was posed to him, or some problem in need of a solution was presented to him, there would be a fair amount of silence before an answer was forthcoming. He was someone who was not afraid to stop and think before speaking, as opposed to someone that I know, and I'm sure that, I think I've spoken about this before, that you also probably know someone or many someones who, when presented with any problem or challenge, without hesitation, responds by saying, you know what you ought to do, because they always know what you ought to do. So thank you for that observation of what you might do as a person in a leadership position. So quick review: liberation means freedom from passion, anger, and fear. So now let's take it one step further. Let's say that the qualifications for a leader are freedom from passion, by which I mean you're not ruled by passion, not that you don't act passionately for a cause that you believe in, or act passionately, enthusiastically when you are doing something, but rather that one is not ruled by or blinded by passion, intense desire for achieving some particular thing or result. Fear and anger. So now, do a little self-assessment and think, how free am I from these three things? And then imagine yourself completely free from these three things. And now place yourself back in this position of leadership. And now, once again, a little assessment. Would anything change? Would you do anything differently? Okay, whoop, a little too soon. Okay. So that's your homework assignment. Consider these different aspects of the qualifications of leadership and ask yourself, does someone that I look up to as a leader have those qualifications? Is it possible for me to develop those qualifications? And as a leader, how would I act? So continuing now with the rest of our verses. Verse 22, O son of Pritha, Arjuna, there are no duties within these three worlds that I am obliged to perform, nor is there anything I aspire to obtain. Nevertheless, I engage myself in prescribed duties. A British Indologist went to India during the colonial time to learn about each one of the various deities in the Hindu pantheon of deities, to learn about them and to ascertain which one was really the supreme being amongst them all. And he went to temples of all manner of gods, deities of Indra, deities of Shiva, deities of Vishnu. And he inquired from the various Brahmins, learned priests, the intellectuals, the theologians. And he concluded that Krishna must be the supreme deity, because every other deity has a job. They have some obligation to do something. Surya has to make the sun run around the universe and show up on its appointed time. Indra has to make sure the weather is operating. Vayu has to make the wind blow, et cetera, et cetera. Ganesh has the job of being a scribe, writing things down. Shiva also has various obligations. Even Vishnu has the job of creating the material world, and then the secondary creation goes to Brahma. He's in charge of actually creating the material universe once the general material world is formed. And then Shiva is in charge of destruction, so he also has a job. All these different gods have jobs, but Krishna doesn't have a job. He can just play. He can do whatever he wants. He has absolutely no obligations whatsoever. Well, that's one way to calculate it, I suppose. But here, Krishna is confirming precisely what this Indologist concluded. He doesn't have any obligations to do anything. He's Bhagavan. He already possesses all qualities in infinite quantity and absolute perfection. All wealth is already his. All power, all knowledge, all beauty. He is the most famous person. There's nothing left for him to attain, and he is completely detached from all of it. And yet, Krishna engages in not just frivolous activities, but prescribed duties. When Krishna actually shows up in the material world, he's described like an actor who puts on a costume and acts on a stage, and he blends in to whatever society he becomes a part of. Now, he kind of, he's a person, he has his own taste, he has his own way of being. But when Krishna was present, according to the telling of his appearance in the Puranas, not everyone recognized who he was. They saw him, but they didn't know that he was the supreme being, the personal form of Bhagavan. he was undercover to those who he didn't reveal himself to. And he did the kind of things that were expected of people of his stature, of his position, but also on a transcendental level now. Krishna is speaking about his responsibility as the greatest of leaders. He's the supreme leader, the Ishvara, the ultimate controller of everything. And what would happen if the ultimate controller, the supreme Param Ishvara, were not to exercise that control? Well, now he describes. Text 23. For should I ever cease to engage in carefully performing such prescribed duties, O Partha, people would surely follow my example in all respects. So here's one way to look at it. Arjuna's a warrior, and he wants to quit. He wants to stop fighting. He wants to blow off his social obligation to be the defender of righteousness. And Krishna is saying, you want to quit, okay? I'm God, and I don't quit. So who do you think you are that you can just blow off your obligations, your social duty? I'm the supreme being. I take care of business. Who are you to just blow this off? And by implication, what he's saying here is that you're a respected warrior. You're famous as a warrior. And if you walk away, what kind of example does that set? In the next verse, 24, all these worlds would fall to ruin if I did not act properly. I would be the cause of chaos in society and would thereby bring harm to all beings. Indirectly here, Krishna is telling Arjuna that although he sees harm coming to everyone by fighting, there's actually a greater harm that will be done by his not fighting. Exactly how this is so will be revealed later in the Bhagavad-gita. It sounds paradoxical, and this particular paradox will be resolved later. So cliffhanger, because I'm not going to give it away now. No giving away the surprises. The bottom line here is that Krishna is giving Arjuna his own example. As the supreme being, he lives up to an obligation to act for the benefit of all beings, and Arjuna should be following his example of great leadership. Not just the king, Janaka, who in our previous webinar, Krishna held up as an example of one who achieved perfection by exemplary action. Any questions about this so far? Go ahead and type anything you have for me in the Q&A box. If you do have anything for me, I'll keep my eye on it. All right. Question. This seems like it could be abused to make people do bad things. Well, yeah, if you're a bad leader and you set a bad example, then people who respect you, even though you're a bad person, will also do really bad things. So, for example, if the leader is a crass and rude person with no sense of propriety or empathy, then when one of his followers is presented with a distressing situation for another person that anyone ought to feel distress over, their reaction might be womp womp. A person following a very bad example of bad leadership. So sure, yeah. In this particular season of time, the age of Kali, the age of quarrel and hypocrisy, it's understood that our leaders will be liars. And people will follow a path of irreligion that masquerades as religion. So sure, the idea that people will follow the leader can and has been abused for nefarious purposes by just such people who come by virtue of their karma to a position of leadership and influence people to follow their very bad example. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us to set a very good example of what is the best way, the most compassionate way, the most fearless way to respond to our destiny. Remember, passion, anger, and fear are what a great leader is free from. And you can easily recognize a poor leader by the extent to which they are controlled by passion, anger, and fear. So we use that as a standard of measurement when we look at a leader whose example we want to emulate, and when we look at the kind of leader we want to become as yogis. All right, we have some other questions or comments. So this is saying that I should do what my dharma is, even if it is hard and maybe I don't want to. If I know something is right and it is what my job is, then I am responsible to do it? Yes. The trick is to actually know what the dharmic response to a situation is. But this is Arjuna's dilemma. He has to do something that's extremely hard, and he doesn't want to do it, but it's his duty to do it. We discussed in earlier webinars that the philosophy of the Bhagavad-gita encourages us to do the right thing simply because it is the right thing to do, and to know the difference between a right and a wrong thing, to use good judgment, discernment in ascertaining what is the best way to respond to any given situation. And the Gita gives us tools by which we can make that judgment in order to know what is the right thing to do in any given circumstance. So yeah, if it's your responsibility to do it, then even if it is unpleasant or uncomfortable, tapasya, austerity, means stepping out, voluntarily stepping outside of one's comfort zone for the sake of personal growth and acting for the benefit of others. So that is tapasya. That is a principle of yoga. And the difficult work of personal transformation comes when we get our hands dirty in the pit of tapasya. I hope that is a satisfactory answer. Okay, another question, comment. I think this speaks to why it is so important to choose leaders and teachers wisely, because in order to fully benefit from that relationship, the student follower has to trust that the leader is acting for the benefit of all beings and therefore is trustworthy to follow completely. Yeah, This is very true. I agree. This has become an issue in contemporary yoga, whether or not teachers who place themselves in a position of leadership or who aspire to positions of leadership are actually trustworthy, whether or not the whole idea of gurus has become anachronistic because we really can't trust anyone who aspires to or attains a position of power. They cannot be trusted not to abuse that trust and that power. So again, yeah, using this criteria in order to choose wisely, in order to fully benefit from the relationship, and also, the leader benefits from a relationship of trust with someone that they are leading, whereas they suffer if they abuse that trust. Remember, an abuse of trust would be something that is a symptom of being controlled by the mode of passion. And the mode of passion results in misery. So when an untrustworthy leader abuses the faith of a follower, then misery follows for all parties concerned. All right, thank you very much for your questions and comments thus far. I'll proceed to the next verse. This is verse 25. O descendant of Bharat, Arjuna, as the ignorant act with attachment to the results of their actions, the wise may act without such attachment for the sake of the world's welfare. So, an ignorant person and a wise person superficially may appear to be doing the exact same work. And therefore, one without the eyes to see the difference between the ignorant and the wise might not be able to make a distinction between the actions of one and the actions of another. It's the motivation that's different, and you can't necessarily see that right away. The one who is acting with attachment for the result is acting in the mode of passion. And they may even be enthusiastically engaged in some form of material welfare work. Their intentions may be altruistic, but still there's attachment for the results, and the results are actually beyond their control. A wise person may also very enthusiastically engage in altruistic activities, but their interest is merely for the sake of the world's welfare, without attachment to the results. In other words, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, as opposed to doing something out of attachment for the results of the action for themselves, or even extended selfishness, meaning desiring a result for someone else. It's a fine line, and not a very easy thing to do, because we're so affected by the world around us and the desire for people to be free from suffering. The one thing that a yogi cannot tolerate is the suffering of others. So a yogi acts without attachment for the sake of providing a good example, with the hope that their action will alleviate the suffering of others on material and spiritual levels, getting both to the symptom and the root cause of whatever their suffering may be. Knowing that they don't have control over the result, that the action simply needs to be performed on the basis of it being the right thing to do. This is very challenging. And this is why yoga, taken off the mat and into our lives, into the world, is in many respects far more challenging than perfecting some aspect of a physical practice. Text 26. A learned person should not disturb the minds of those who, due to a poor fund of knowledge, act with attachment to the fruits of their actions. Instead, the wise inspire delight in prescribed duties by performing them in a spirit of devotion. So here is where the exemplary part of the action is not in the action itself, but in the mood, in the spirit of the action. If someone is completely convinced that they must act and they must get the results of their action, and nothing short of acquiring the result of the action constitutes success, then the odds are that if you try and convince them to change their motivation, to not be attached to the results of their action, then you're not being helpful. And if what you're doing is not seen as being helpful, you're not helping. I had a boss once in one of my jobs in my previous career who was really a good boss. He understood my nature, and he gave me a lot of leeway in my job description, pulling together various aspects of an organization for marketing purposes. And one piece of advice he gave me was push the envelope, but try not to break it. Because he knew that that was my nature, to be a disruptor. And he also cautioned me, if what you're doing is not perceived as helpful, you're not helping. So here, that's just something that always stuck with me. And then I found it in this verse. Krishna gives very similar advice to Arjuna, that if trying to explain this standard of action to someone only disturbs them, don't bother. Inspire them to act in such a way that they will have their consciousness elevated. Rather than trying to convince them by argument, engage them in some action, or inspire them in some action, and engage in your own action in a spirit of devotion, in a spiritual consciousness that they will find inspiring, and that they may want to emulate. If they see that you are able to perform the same action that they are performing, but you're not getting all tied up in knots over it because your attachment to the results is not the same as theirs, it may occur to them on their own that adopting your mode of being while you act will be better for their mental health, may actually help them get the result that they want better than the mood that they're applying to it. And then you will have helped someone elevate their consciousness indirectly, rather than by a logical argument. In a later part of that same prior career, I was traveling by rail with the president of a smaller company. He'd come in specifically for the purpose of getting this small company ready to be bought by a larger company. That was just what he did. I never really understood how that works. But that was his specialty, was to come in and prepare a smaller company to be acquired by a larger company. And we had time to speak on this rail trip, and I shared this idea with him, the idea of acting without passion, without being ruled by passion. And he really just couldn't wrap his head around it. He just couldn't see how you could be detached and still act enthusiastically. And I tried to explain it to him this way and that way and the other way, and used this example and that example, and it just wasn't happening for him. Now, there's any number of reasons why he just might not have been able to understand this. But I realized after a few shots that he simply didn't accept the idea or any of its underlying premises, that one, from his point of view, must approach one's work from a passionate standpoint and with intense attachment to the success of your undertaking. So I found a way to segue out of that conversation into something else. The temptation may be to want to share this idea with others, and using good judgment as to when that will be an effective proposition and when you just have to let it go and be an example of what you're talking about rather than talking about it, is something we have to use when engaging with others, when interacting with others. Okay. So, the ever popular, okay, so. That's tonight's program, except that this is not tonight's program. That was tonight's program last week. Once again, I have failed. Any questions? Please type your questions or comments into the Q&A box. If it should come to pass that no questions or comments arise in your mind now, but they do arise later, my email address, hari@harikirtan.com, is where you can send your comments, questions, realizations about this portion of the text. I am always very, very happy to hear from you and look forward to hearing from you. I will also post something in the Facebook group that I hope will give you impetus to participate in further discussion. You may also want to go to the Facebook group and just post something there, be it an alternative translation that you have found in a text in an edition of the Bhagavad-gita that you are reading, or some other point that relates to what we've been discussing. In the other resources department, Tara Mitchell has written a book called The Yoga of Leadership. It's how the practice of yoga helps people cultivate the qualities that are essential to leadership success. Now, this is a book that is particularly aimed at people in the corporate sphere. It applies to also any organization where leadership and engaging a group of people comes into play. And it's an interesting way of approaching leadership in that Tara uses the model of the 5 koshas, or the 5 different layers of the body in yoga philosophy, going from the exterior food body, the body that's just made of food, to our energy body, our mental emotional body, our intellectual body, our bliss body, etc. And prescribes different yoga practices that affect each level of the body, and that together combine to help one develop the qualities of a leader and to provide a good example for others in an organization to lead a healthy, balanced life and be able to engage enthusiastically in activities from a mental, emotional position of yogic detachment. So for your consideration, given that we're talking about leadership and leadership by example, you can check out Tara's book at the usual places. Go to her website, taramitchell.com. I am very, very happy to be heading back to beautiful downtown Cumberland, Maryland, the Gilchrist Museum. I will be doing a meditation immersion weekend on Saturday and Sunday. I'm actually kicking off the proceedings for the weekend with a Friday night yoga class, also at the Gilchrist Museum. If you are in the Cumberland, Frostburg area, please join me for that. Next week, we will continue with Karma Yoga. We'll talk about confused action, or action of the confused, disciplined action, and the results of both, verses 327 to 32. So if you don't have the information about the Facebook group, it's Bhagavad-gita Satsang. And if you like, just let me know. Send me an email, Hari@Hari-kirtana.com. Just remind me, send me an email, and I will be sure to, oh, wait a minute. No, don't bother. Just read the newsletter I'm going to send you anyway. When I send you the newsletter that has the recordings, the recording for tonight and the link for all of our recordings that live on my website, I will also include a link to the Facebook group, and then you can request membership, and I promise you your membership request will be approved. So yes, there's a separate Facebook group that you can go to and continue the discussion there with or without me. And that's the idea. Any last questions or comments that you have for me? Because time is running out. Better hurry up. Time's a-wasting. Clock's ticking. I'm getting ready to go. Da-dip. That's all, folks. Oh, good. All right, you found it. Well, you're welcome. I'm going to send you that newsletter with the links anyway. All right. Thank you very, very much once again for spending your evening with me. It's always a great pleasure and an honor to have all of you here who are able to join us in real time. And thank you, and thank you very much for all of you, the many of you who I know join us after the fact. Thank you very much as well for spending your time with me. So yes, you are all very, very welcome. Thank you for your thanks. I'm delighted to see you all here and know that so many of you are listening after the fact. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your evening. I look forward to seeing you this time next week or sometime soon. End meeting for all.